Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Somil Sarkar. I am a course instructor of climate change extreme events. Today is the first class of this course, NPTEL course, where we will basically talk about climate science basics, what is exactly the difference between weather versus climate, and how we can understand the foundation of climate science using the basics of the weather versus climate phenomena across the globe. So, in this lecture, we will primarily focus on what is the understanding the definition of weather and climate, what is the difference between weather and climate, how we can recognize, for example, the time scales, the spatial scales and of weather and climate phenomena across the globe. And then we will also talk about some of the examples which is giving a case study for weather events and also for the climate patterns across the globe. So, this is the overall learning objective of this particular course lecture. So, what is exactly weather? So, weather, for example, if you refer to the state of atmosphere at a specific place or particular time. So, sometimes we call what is the temperature today, let us say what is the rainfall happening at a one particular location, or let us say what is the humidity level, or different types of meteorological parameters, for example, which is also written here, for example, temperature, humidity, precipitation, winds and the pressure, for example. So, these are the characteristics for short term which can be explained by minutes to week, or let us say these are the variables which are highly variable in nature. For example, we talk about a rainy afternoon, or let us say we talk about a snowstorm. So, these are some of the examples which basically signifies what is exactly weather. We can also see here one of the graphical representation of rainfall pattern across the globe. Here you can see the pattern is continuously changing, which is basically suggesting the variable state of the meteorological conditions across different parts of the world, and that is basically signifies how weathers are basically changes over one place to other place like that. Now, on the other hand, if you talk about climate, what is exactly climate? Climate we can explain as a long term average of weather over extended period, typically 30 years or more. Climate has certain characteristics. For example, it has long term trends. It has you can explain the climate as an average trends for particular region, or maybe we can also talk about variability, or what is exactly the extreme nature of the climate, how hydroclimatic extremes are forming in one particular locations. Different types of extremes can be considered. For example, if you talk about tropical climate, or let us say you can talk about polar climate. Here is the example of let us say a Köppen climate classification system. Here you can see that there are 5 different types of climates are visible here. For example, we can talk about tropical, which has certain temperature or rainfall characteristics. For example, there are dry regions where we have higher temperature, low rainfall. For example, there are temperate region and continental region, and there is also the polar regions, which has a very specific type of meteorological conditions. Therefore, these are different types of climate systems as proposed by Köppen. So, this is basically we can define by how we can define basically the climate in different across world. But when you compare, let us say, weather and versus climate, how these two meteorological things are similar or dissimilar in what sense? For example, if you compare weather at a time scale feature, weather can be explained by short term or in a days, or climate can be explained by let us say long term in decades. Spatial scale, if you are talking about, let us say you can talk you can explain weather in the localized manner in a one particular city or district level or village level, for example. Or if you talk about climate, you can basically talk about a regional coverage or spatial scale, or sometimes we can also say at a global scale as well. So, if you talk about, let us say, variability of both the different features, weather or climate, the weather is basically highly variable. Sometimes you have very low temperature, sometimes you have very high temperature, sometimes you have no rainfall at all, sometimes you have very heavy rainfall. Therefore, weather has a very variable characteristics. However, if you talk about climate, has a moderate variability, but it is a long term characteristic source of one particular region, for example, regional or global scale. Here you can also understand both the terminologies in terms of analogies. For example, weather is your mood and climate is your personality. This is how we can explain in a very general terms how we can define these two different terms. For example, here in the left bottom part, you can see that there is a temperature profile of Delhi city, and there is also a relative humidity of one particular the midnight, noon and midnight, for example, for whole particular day. And you can see there is a higher fluctuation of the ambient temperature as well as your relative humidity across different time period. On the other hand, if you look at long term trend of climate of different cities across India. For example, let us say you talk about Chennai, Mumbai, Delhi or Bengaluru. Here you can say that the 1882 the temperature of, let us say, Chennai was 27.9 degrees centigrade. Now it has been increased to 288.8 degrees centigrade. However, if you compare to the fluctuation of temperature in terms of let us say in weather, it is not that much. However, for the climate perspectives, it is a very important increment, because it is basically a long term change in the climate behavior of one particular city or regions like that. Similarly, you can also see multiple different examples here. We can see that Mumbai, which is also showing a continuously increasing trend of temperature. You can also see the Delhi temperature, it is also like that. You can also see, let us say, Bengaluru temperature, which is also significantly increasing from past few decades like that. So, here with this analogy, with this diagrams, we can basically understand about how we can differentiate between, let us say, what is exactly weather and what is exactly climate, and how these two terminologies can be compared or can be differentiated with each other, and we can understand about how we can relate the weather phenomena or how we can relate the climatic phenomena for different regions across different regions across the world like that. Moving forward, what is exactly why we should bother about the differences of these two terminologies? What is the importance of differentiating between weather and climate? Why it is so important? Because when we are differentiating between weather and climate, it is very crucial for several regions. Some of the regions I have listed here. For example, the first region is understanding the patterns. When you know the difference between, let us say, weather and climate, you can identify the short term variability versus long term trend in one particular region or city or district, for example, or which is very essential for studying let us say the global change like warming or cooling in one particular locations in different parts of the world. For example, if we are interested in talking about predicting the events, let us say weather forecast help prepare for immediate conditions, while when we are talking about, let us say, climate, which analysis aids in planning for future risk like droughts, floods, rising temperature, and how these different changes meteorological conditions, weather patterns are basically leads to a very different climatic conditions altogether when you compare to the previous decade or past climatic behavior of a particular city or region like that. The third important point is, let us say, policy and adaptation. why we are looking at the differences between these two terminologies. For example, when we are looking at climate focused studies, which is basically important for long term policy making, and however, when you are talking about weather predictions are vital for day to day decision making and disaster management. For example, if we are interested in what is going to happen next day, is there any big rainfall or higher amount of rainfall in one particular region, then we are talking about, let us say, a very short term forecast. However, if you are interested in what is the overall changes in the climatic behavior, so that we can correlate with the climate change pattern of a particular region, then we are interested in what is the overall climate changes or long term policies of that particular regions, like that. The fourth important point is, for example, scientific clarity. It prevents confusion between, let us say, if you talk about daily anomalies, whether we are seeing that temperature is fluctuating. However, when you are saying that okay, the global temperature is rising and therefore there is a more global warming compared to the past few decades in the so this, when you have difference between weather and climate terminologies, you basically can these confusions can be can provide you more scientific clarities for understanding these terminologies, like that. Now, the important thing about weather is you have to understand about what is the factors which are influencing the weather. For example, I have listed down some of the factors with some graphical representations. For example, if you talk about atmospheric pressure, weather is influenced by atmospheric pressure. For example, determine the movement of air and development of weather system. For example, if you are talking about cyclones which forms in low pressure, or if you talk about, let us say, anticyclones which are associated with the high pressure systems. There is another factor which might influence the weather behavior, for example, temperature, which derives the evaporation, condensation cycle and crucial for precipitation pattern of different region. Then the third important thing is, let us say, humidity. The amount of moisture sometimes also tells about what is the potential for cloud formation and precipitation in one particular region or different state, for example. For example, if you talk about, let us say, tropical region with higher humidity experience frequent rainfall. When we are talking about, let us say, desert region or arid region where we have lower amount of humidity and there are very minimal precipitation. Therefore, these are the some of the factors which basically can leads to changes in the humidity pattern, and which is basically behave overall the weather pattern of one particular region. Also, there is wind patterns which basically moves the air masses from one place to another place, and basically would distribute the heat, moisture and pollutants across region, which can also be sometimes influence the weather pattern of one particular different areas. So, if you look at here in the right side, this diagram, this tells you about multiple different factors. For example, here I have listed atmospheric pressure, temperature, humidity, wind patterns, and precipitation is also a very crucial factors which basically defines the what is the overall temperature or the precipitation pattern in one different regions, or if you compare to multiple different regions, like that. So, this is how we can differentiate, or you can basically define the weather patterns based on certain different factors. On the other hand, if you are talking about, let us say, climate, what are those factors which are influencing the climate? Here I have listed some of them. For example, you can talk about latitude wise. If you compare, let us say, climate of those regions which are higher latitude regions, polar regions, or let us say if you talk about those climatic pattern in lower latitude region, or the region are which is very close to the equator, for example. So, therefore, the latitudes also certainly influence the climatic pattern. It is basically based on the intensity of the sunlight which is we received, and how basically energy is received by the sun's radiations are different from one place to another place, like that. Then the second factor is basically the elevation. Let us say if you talk about the regions which are, the elevation is very not that much. However, if you talk about elevation of mountain regions, for example, let us say you talk about the elevations of Everest or some other mountainous Himalayan part of regions, where we also see that there is a significant difference in the climatic behavior. For example, those are higher mountainous regions are colder region, or those regions which are in lower elevation might have more heat or more warm regions, for example, if compared to based on these two system based on the elevations, for example. Then you can also there is a climate can also be influenced by ocean currents, which is basically important for regulating the global temperature by redistributing the heat across one place to the another place, for example. And also there are another factor, for example, here you can see these the ocean currents which is moving around the globe, and which is basically responsible for distributing the heat from one place to the another place by movement of water current from one place to another place, like that. Then you can also important factor is vegetation. For example, vegetation affects climate by modifying the surface temperature and also the humidity levels, and it is also sometimes affect overall the precipitation pattern in one particular city or region, or let us say temperature pattern in different cities or regions, like that. So for example, if you talk about Amazon rainforest, which is how there are very different climatic pattern than if you compare to these rainforests with the other dry lands or arid regions, for example. So this is how basically vegetation can be also a influencing factor, which can also influence the climatic behavior of one particular region. Then the another important point is human activities, which is sometimes or more significantly alter the natural climate through greenhouse gas emission, and can also lead to land use, land cover change, which can basically change the overall energy budget, water partitioning, or let us say can change the overall hydrological behavior of one particular system, like that. So therefore, human activities are also very important factor, which leads to influencing the climate of one particular region, and therefore it has a potential to change the behavior of climate of one particular region compared to your let us say baseline conditions, like that. So these are the factors which basically influence the climate of one different regions accordingly based on different types of interactions. There is some of the examples of, let us say, these are the weather events which has happened very recently. For example, if you talk about Hurricane Katrina, which is basically one of the hurricane occurred in 29th of August 2005. It was a landfall in Louisiana as a category 3 hurricane, and it has a significant impact. For example, over 1,800 fatalities and $125 billion damage this cyclone has occurred because of the catastrophic nature of this cyclone events. For example, other example you can say the European heat waves, where in 2022, where it was observed that temperature exceeded 40 degree during summer in several higher latitude countries, for example UK, Spain, and other European nations, for example France also. Here these events has a significant impact. It has contributed to widespread wildfires in southern Europe, and how because of the increasing temperature and all. There is another, let us say weather extreme events, for example local thunderstorm, which is basically can be defined as sudden short lived storms typically involving heavy rainfall, lightning and strong winds, and this has a very significant impact. For example, let us say flash flooding. If you talk about the weather phenomena which happened in Kedarnath flood in 2013, or let us say several other types of flooding events which has happened in Indian or different countries as well. So these are the some of the example of weather events which are happen across different parts of the world. These are the some of the examples of climate patterns in different parts of the world. For example, if you talk about large scale and a longer time period behavior of a climate of different region, one of them we can explain that ENSO, that's El Nino Southern Oscillation. ENSO is basically a reoccurring climate pattern which is basically involving the temperature fluctuation in the Pacific Ocean, and because of these the temperature fluctuations can lead to very different precipitation or temperature events across different parts of the world. For example, during the El Nino, the warmer than average SST causing droughts in some part of the world. However, if you have the La Nina conditions, this is the cooler than average sea surface temperature, which is called SST, causing intensify monsoon rains across different parts of the world. So these are the some of the phenomena which basically influence the weather behaviors, and therefore on the longer scale, time scale or larger spatial scale, these has a very significant impact on different different climatological behavior of regions. Then the another example of, let's say, climatic pattern is monsoon. So if you talk about monsoon, a periodic wind system which is especially in the Indian Ocean and southern Asia, which comes towards to Indian region, and that basically brings lots of rainfall, particularly during the June, July, August and September months, and basically it is responsible for lots of monsoon dependent activities in Indian region. This is one of the very important climatic behavior or pattern in this in the Indian subcontinent region, which are very robust and basically happening in the longer time scale for the larger spatial scale also. Then if you can talk about, let's say, Arctic warming trends in the higher latitude or region. For example, if you see that Arctic region is warming at more than twice the global average, a phenomena which is we call as Arctic amplification. It causes very significant impact of melting of ice to global, which leads to increase in the sea level rise, global sea level rise like that. So these are some of the examples of climate patterns which can define the climatic behavior of different regions across the global scale, and can be understand by differentiating their behavior across one place to another place as well. Moving forward, for example, how we can tell that what is the interaction between weather and climate in different regions, how these two different terminologies are basically related to each other. So if you talk about, let's say, weather events, so some of the weather events set the context for climate in one particular region, which is why these are dependent terminologies. Then you can also talk weather anomalies, which can basically influence long term climate patterns. You can understand by, let's say, persistent drought conditions in a different region, or sometimes when you talk about, let's say, extreme weather events, often tied to the climate trends, and therefore they are also lead to change in the climatic behavior in different parts of the world. Climate phenomena can be also be understood by understanding the feedback loop of different pattern. For example, there is a two types of feedback loop which can be exist. One is basically positive feedback loop, another is called the negative feedback loop, where in the positive feedback loop, we, let's say, there is a increasing amount of global warming across the globe, and therefore what we see that there is an increasing melting, more ice melt and more snow melts across the whole world, and therefore it basically increases, changes the land use land cover characteristics, which basically changes the sunlight reflections reflected by ice and snow, and there is basically more absorption, more heat, and therefore that leads to more global warming across. So this is a kind of a positive feedback loop which basically exaggerate the climatic phenomena in different locations or different regions. There is another feedback loop, for example, called negative feedback loop, where let us say if the global warming is increasing, it is basically let us say more ocean evaporation into the cloud, and therefore these sunlights and reflected by this cloud formation because of the more enhanced water evaporation to the atmosphere, and therefore that leads to a decrease in the global warming conditions. That is also possible, and therefore this is also called negative feedback loop. So if you understand through this positive feedback or negative feedback loop, there is some certain sense of weather patterns which sometimes influence your long term the climatic behavior and for different regions as well. So this is how we can understand what is the interaction between weather and climate in the regions. So in this particular lecture, we have understood about, let us say, what is exactly weather, what is exactly climate. We can summarize that weather can be explained by short term localized and variable kind of system. However, if you talk about, let us say, climate can be considered as a long term average and regional or global scale phenomena, where there is a change in changes in some properties are gradual, but it is basically changes if you compare to, let us say, past few decades of climate of one particular region, or let us say the current climatic conditions, then you can understand what is the average change or mean behavior change of one particular regions about different types of meteorological parameters. It is also very important to understand about the differences between the climate and weather, because the distinction is critical for understanding the climate science, and it is also very useful when you are saying, let us say, policy making, or let us say defining some sort of different types of modeling or activities which are there in, or let us say forecasting, or let us say prediction for different types of systems in the climates. So therefore, the understanding between these two different terminologies are very important in climate science, and that is basically what we have discussed during this class. You can also go through some of these links. For example, this is AWS IMD link, where you can click and you can basically see that what is the different types of temperature, rainfall, relative humidity, different types of meteorological parameters, variability across different cities or different regions in Indian subcontinent, Indian country. And you can also go to this particular link and can see that how the spatial distribution of different meteorological properties are varying across different time period. So this can help you to understand more about what is exactly weather and what is exactly climate, and then you can basically compare, let us say, what is exactly weather and climate of your regions of interest, where you are living or where you are residing or watching this video, for example. You can also look at one of the app which is called Mausam, designed by Indian Meteorology Department, IMD. Therefore, it can be used to can get an idea about what is exactly rainfall, what is temperature, what is relative humidity, and all other different meteorological properties as well. So these are some of the activities I have suggested, which you can go through and can understand about more on weather and climate system of different region. So for this particular course and whatever I have just covered, I have taken some of the references from the IPCC report, weather and GOV, this particular site, and there are several other sites, for example, Mausam IMD, AWS IMD, and WMO. So these are the some of the references I have taken to basically to give a brief overview about how you can differentiate between weather and climate when you are studying the climate science or climate change subject. There are several key books which are also very useful to understand further on this particular subject. For example, you can read about atmosphere, climate, weather and climate, which is basically Roger Barry book. Then you can also read about, let's say, Introduction to Modern Climate Change, which is written by Andrew Dessler. You can also read about Atmospheric Science by John M. Wallace, and you can also read about these other two books, which is very can give you a brief overview about how you can basically differentiate between the different types of climate behavior, different types of tools which are there, how you can understand global warming, how you can understand what factors which are attributes to global climate change in different regions altogether, like that. So this is the overall the lecture 1, which I would like to give you a brief overview about what is exactly weather and what is exactly climate, so that you can understand the basics between these two different phenomena. Then we can further look into more detailed concept. So thank you for your attention. In the next lecture, we will primarily focus on what is exactly climate change and how we can define it, and that is the next lecture we will plan to give you an overview about this. Thank you for your attention.